by acknowledging that we're based on Whadjuk Noongar land and that the Whadjuk Noongar people continue to practice their traditions, knowledges and beliefs, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So, as you know, we've got 4 presentations today. Run through the presentations, questions at the end. Mark Riboldi is our first presenter. It's a real pleasure to have you here, Mark. Mark is going to be talking to us about civil society support for international students and other temporary migrants during COVID-19, which is a very topical issue for us. So thank you, Mark. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Ian. And this is a paper that I'm working on with a colleague of mine at Sydney University, Kurt Iverson. And yeah, essentially the title says it all, quite descriptive, and we'll kind of go into it from there. I guess my interest in it, this subject, just broadly as part of that PhD and my broader studies, is just that tension between how civil society has this normative expectation that, or this idea that it's through civil society that people and communities are able to mediate power and kind of negotiate power between the state and the market. So, you know, Richard on Friday night was talking about the importance of politicians potentially in democracy. For me, the civil society part is very important because it's through civil society that all of that messy interaction takes place, where who those politicians are is chosen. And kind of people learn leadership skills, they go back and forth and build community, all this kind of things. There are, in that sense, a few challenges for civil society organisations. So if that last slide was the promise, this is part of the reality, and the reality is always a little bit messy, which is why there's lots of arrows going everywhere. And so over particularly the last 20 to 30 years, things like government-funded service delivery have affected the way that civil society and civil society organisations respond to people's needs. There are restrictions on advocacy, so the way that the government doesn't really like when organisations complain about what they're doing, and so they put restrictions on them. And that kind of corporate governance of civil society organisations has kind of, in a way, in the way that I think about it, taken the focus for a lot of civil society organisations, particularly the bigger ones, away from here and what the people want to do, and push them more towards up there, towards the market and the state. They're more interested in thinking about, well, how do I get money? How do I challenge power? Those kind of things, rather than how do I best serve and look after these people. So that's kind of my broad area of interest. And so I guess the context for that for me today is thinking about international students during COVID-19. So this is an already vulnerable community, so international students were already more likely to be at risk of underemployment, of economic exploitation, of being in housing insecurity before COVID. And because these international students, or many international students, were working in industries that were shut down almost overnight, particularly in the eastern states, so hospitality and tourism, international students were thrown into crisis pretty much straight away. And the Australian government basically told international students to go home if you didn't like it. So there's kind of this, and not all international students are able to just go home on a whim for the government. There's a lot of reasons why they can't. So those kind of students were thrown into crisis by the pandemic. And so I'm interested in how civil society organisations might have helped international students, or tried to help international students during the pandemic. So that's my going question, which is pretty much exactly what I just said. So how did civil society organisations support international students and other temporary migrants during COVID-19? And the theoretical approach that I'm taking to this is around Harry Hahn, who's an American social movement scholar, and her work particularly around how organisations develop activists and how people move into social movements, how they move into organisations, and how organisations can actually support the aspirations of those people. So Hahn's 2014 work around civic associations and leadership in the 21st century puts forward, I guess, this scale. It's not really a scale, it's more different types of ways that activities can be done, based between transactional and transformational. So I'm kind of loosely adapting what Hahn's doing. So I guess in terms of a transactional intervention with volunteers that Hahn might talk about. So the way that organisations the way that they mobilise volunteers, particularly recently in this kind of crowdsourced politics era, is that they might get donations online. They just get people to click money and give us money, and then we'll go and do what we do. Or they mobilise people by online petitions. They say, sign these petitions, and we'll send 200,000 messages to the government. So that's a very transactional way of dealing with a volunteer. Whereas more transformational ones might be organising forums where volunteers can come, they can meet each other, they can kind of share their own interests, and they can kind of plan activities together. So kind of more leadership development type activities. So broadly, this will be a transactional, kind of very quick and sharp interaction with each other, and transformation much more relational. So it kind of gives people the opportunity to change. So it's not transformational in terms of the policy transforming, it's more transformational in terms of the people and the organisations involved. So from a community connection point of view, which I'm interested in, a transactional organisation would only deal with real people in service provision. So they might say, well, you come in the door, you need help with this, we'll do this, and then off you go. Whereas a transformational organisation might have people with experience on their boards, might be kind of have advisory committees that are kind of open to changing themselves and the people through what they do. So that's kind of the broad scale of what I'm interested in. And Han basically says that good organisations do a combination of both. So you can't just do the transformational stuff. You also need some transaction, and the transaction helps mobilise people to action. Whereas the transformational builds relationships required for this action to be successful. I can talk about Han for hours, but that's not what we're talking about today. So my methodology here is to build a case study of civil society support for international students during the pandemic, particularly in my local area in Sydney. So this emerged from a larger data set and research project that I've been working on for a few years, where essentially I got to interview and run focus groups with around 110 people from different civil society organisations in Sydney and New South Wales and across the country, because we're doing things via Zoom, where we're talking about their experiences of COVID. So this story kind of grew out of that. We heard a lot of people talk about it. And once we found that with that story, we thought, oh, this is really important. So we started going in a bit deeper to it. So we had initial field notes, interviews, focus group. And at the moment, Kurt and I are now going back and saying, well, there's some things we missed in here. And so we're going back and talking to people and finding out what really went on. These are the kind of people that we're talking to here. So there's a mixture here of different types of organisations. So there's, Redfern and Marrickville Legal Centres are very, they're community legal organisations, and they're used to, I would say, providing kind of transactional kind of support to people. The Australian Red Cross is very similar, so they get lots of money from the government, they do disaster relief. Whereas an organisation like Sydney Community Forum, it's just that they don't do service provision at all. All they do really is kind of hold and create spaces for different community members to come in to run projects that connect with each other. It's kind of a mixture of different types of organisations. And there's a mixture of, there's the three key organisations, Addison Road Community Organisation, which is basically a community centre, which is near my house in Sydney, which is how I found out about this story, because I go down there regularly. The Sydney Alliance, which is a community organising organisation, and the Sydney Community Forum, which again, as I mentioned, is also kind of a community organising focus. But then you've got in there, you might not have heard of any of those organisations, but then you've got in there kind of big ones, which you've probably heard of, like the Australian Red Cross. You've got Get Up in there, that kind of the advocacy organisation. You've got University of New South Wales, Jesuit Refugee Services. So there's kind of these big, well-known civil society organisations, and then some not really well-known ones. You don't really know those if you're kind of kicking around my local area. Or, Addison Road is now famous because of some of the things that went on down there during COVID. So three aspects to the story, I guess, of thinking about the analysis. So I'm just going to so the first is the mutual aid aspect. So the students, largely in both Sydney Community Forum and Addison Road, they kind of approached the people down there because they knew that their friends and themselves needed help. And so they go down to places like Addison Road. They took it over on Fridays and Saturdays eventually, and they kind of went down, they ran all the volunteers. So Addison Road was, at the height of the pandemic, kind of sending out thousands and thousands of food boxes every week that volunteers like football teams and premiers and CEOs were going down and helping do it. And on Friday afternoons and Saturdays, the students would take it over. and they would run the thing. They kind of get other students to come from different parts of Sydney to come and get the boxes and take it to different places. They'd be telling the CEOs what to do. So that was kind of the importance of that mutual aid. One of the people we talked to from the Sydney Community Forum, one of the interesting parts of it, they were saying that the first thing that people needed was to have those immediate needs met. So they eventually, as I'll kind of point out, they went into creating an organisation and they went into doing systemic advocacy, but without actually having those immediate needs met, that mutual aid of those students helping each other, of making sure they had food, of making sure that, for a while, there were about 100 students who were kind of about to start pitching tents at Addison Road because they had some space there and they had somewhere to sleep. So without taking care of those, then nothing else could have happened. And so that immediate needs the way with mutual aid is not necessarily a transactional way of doing things, but the way that we sometimes think about charity of immediate needs is quite one. So those immediate needs can be transactional and transformational the way that we do it, but without that mutual aid and without looking after those, nothing else can happen first. It's kind of the first thing that needs to happen there. The second thing is an advocacy coalition that built up around these students, which was convened by the Sydney Alliance. Excuse me. And as I mentioned, the Sydney Alliance are a community organising organisation, which comes out of a tradition in the United States around Saul Alinsky and I'd say kind of faith-based organising in neighbourhoods and communities as a pathway to change. And so this organisation is trying to mirror some of that stuff in Sydney. And so the Sydney Community Forum, who run by an amazing woman originally from India, Asha Ramzan. She had to force the issue onto the community, the Sydney Alliance agenda, which is reasonably interesting itself. So there's an organisation where you've got small organisations like her, but then you've also got large organisations like Uniting Church and different unions. And she had to really push hard to say, no, you think what you've been talking about for the last year is important. This is important right now because all of these students are going to they're homeless and at risk of starving. We need to do something about it now. So this kind of smaller organisation within a larger one kind of pushed the issue to the agenda. And the way that the Sydney Alliance coordinates the coalition is equally interesting for me because they didn't, and it's kind of you can organise a coalition or a campaign via those kind of transactional or transformational principles. And so the way that the Sydney Alliance did it was by making sure or wanting the students to be at the centre of the campaign. So at every campaign meeting, they kind of start by hearing from the students about what they're going through that week and where things are at and what they're up to. And then they go into the more general business of the rest of the meeting. Another part, and when I talk about loose coordination, so some advocacy campaigns have a very strong hierarchical focus at the top. And so there's a lot of people doing lots of things around the bottom, but at the top there's this very centralized, coordinated, planned out thing. This wasn't happening in this campaign. This campaign brought together students who would talk about their immediate experience and what had gone on, and then the organisations who were involved were invited to suggest how they might commit to helping what the students wanted during the campaign. And they were quite successful. So they didn't get, initially they wanted to get the same supports for students that the rest of Australian citizens had. So they wanted to give them access to JobKeeper and JobSeeker programs. That was their campaign aid. They didn't get that, but what they did get is support from local and state governments for housing, for food relief, for which basically covered off the same kind of things. So they got that kind of access, particularly in Sydney, but I know also in South Australia, that similar kind of gains were made that kind of relieved that pressure off those students so they were able to kind of keep going. The third aspect, that's transactional. And the third thing that came out, which is really interesting for me as a kind of a civil society scholar, is the formation of the Oz International Student Hub. And so the students realised through this they had no place to actually go to meet, to organise, to help each other. So they, through the course of this, they organised and got funding from the New South Wales government and the City of Sydney to set up the Oz International Student Hub. It was auspiced first by an education provider who their classes had to shut down, so they said, well, you can use our space if you want. And now it's auspiced by the Sydney Community Forum, so they've got a physical space to do those things. So there's really, in that sense, the three things that happen. You've got that mutual aid where people are helping each other, students are helping each other and meeting those immediate needs. There's advocacy around trying to change the system to get support for all international students who are involved. And then the third aspect is that trying to create an organisation to provide ongoing support after the crisis. So for me, there's, in terms of, I guess, some of the themes that are coming out here that I find really interesting is, one is the role of place and space. So nothing would have been possible in this without a virtual and a physical space. So the physical space of Addison Road, where the students went to first to take over and get those food boxes. And then on Friday afternoons and Saturdays, they would also, in the afternoons, they would sit around, they'd play music, they'd talk to each other. Eventually they started asking organisations to come down and talk to them about their rights and employment. Without that physical space that Rosanna, the CEO of Addison Road, just provided for them. She said, well, you need some space, we've got space, just come down and do what you want, which is very much her approach. But without that, nothing would have, great, that's perfect, would have happened. The second is that online space, and so that's why I've got that picture up there. The online space of how Sydney Community Forum and Sydney Alliance organised and worked with those students through Zoom, and so use that space. And so space in this sense in civil society is not so much about a physical location, it's about holding a location. So the organisations of Addison Road and Sydney Alliance, they kind of create and hold a space and invite people into it, and using their power, I guess, of having that space and being able to hold it to help people. So that's I find that very interesting in terms of what's coming out of the case study. The second part is about empowerment of those students, and so this is very much the transformational way that the organisations approached working with the students. So Rosanna, as I mentioned, the CEO of Addison Road, she didn't say, oh, we've got these spaces, you can do these things here. She just said, we've got these spaces, use them for what you want. And then she'd go and sit down and listen to them and say, oh, you sound like you've got problems with employment. Do you want us to organise some lawyers to come down? They go, oh yeah, that'd be good. And so they do that. So it's very much responding to the need and using the connections that an organisation has to respond directly to what the people are asking for. From a Sydney Alliance and Sydney Community Forum, as I mentioned, they were first centering them within that advocacy campaign. And secondly, we think about the types of organisations that are there. You've got Get Up and the Australian Red Cross, which are large multi-million-dollar organisations, and they're run largely by professionals who are quite good at public speaking, at doing all of these kind of things. And so the Sydney Community Forum provided a mentoring support for those students to say, here are the kind of environments that you're going to be in. You've got a right to be there, but what kind of skills, what do you want to talk about beforehand? What do you want to talk about when you're there? And so they kind of rehearse, they mentor, they practice. Afterwards, they debrief with them and say, well, how did you find that interaction? And they go, well, that was actually better than I thought it was. So they kind of provide a wraparound support for that. And the third one is that students at the centre of it, which is kind of similar to the empowerment that, but I guess from a slightly different point of view. So very consciously from some of those organisations' point of view, we talk about, and people have been talking about it over the last couple of days, talking about people with lived experience and the importance of that. But you can do working with people, or real people as I like to call them, you can do that transactionally, where you go, oh, politicians only listen to stories from people, so I'm going to go and try and get this person to give me their story so I can go and talk to the politician. Or you can do it in a way where you're providing a space where those people's needs are forefronted every time, and if they've got a story and they want to tell it, they will tell it. So that kind of putting those students at the centre in the way that are working, for me, was quite unique in how it evolved. So just, I guess, in conclusion, and the next steps really. So Kurt and I are still finishing those follow-up interviews, and we kind of want to turn it into a couple of papers. One potentially for third sector review, and the other one has been accepted. The abstract's been accepted to a geography journal. So there's two interests of Kurt's really interested in the place and the space as a human geographer and how that's happening, and I'm really interested in that organisation of how civil society organisations can move out and contract in around people and communities and be a bit more nimble and flexible to help people. So that's everything, and I hope that was interesting, and I look forward to some questions.
Thank you, Mark. That was wonderful. And yes, please do think about the journal, Third Sector Review, for your papers. It'd be great to get some of the great papers from this conference going to the journal. So, we've got Kahurangi up next. Kahurangi, can you hear us again?
Yes, yep, okay.
So, do you want to try sharing your slides now? Perfect, great. Okay, so we can see them. So I'll introduce you and then hand over to you to present.
Fantastic.
Excellent. All right. So as you can see from the slide here, Kahurangi is going to be talking to us about creating public good through sharing food, an emergent community food network, community providing food security during 2020 COVID-19 lockdown in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Kahurangi, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ian. First of all, I wanted to say hi to Mark and say I am fangirling your research, I think. I'm really taken with Han in this transactional and transformational way of thinking. And I think, you know, as I go through this, hopefully you'll see too that we're really similar thinking about civil society organisations. So this is the research project done with a research team that I'm presenting, and about the lockdown experience of this organisation, Common Unity, and that's the Ramakery Cafe there, based in Lower Hutt in the Wellington region of New Zealand. So, ko waiau, he uri ahau no Ngāti Pukenga no Ngaitirangi. So I'm from the Ngāti Pukenga and Ngaitirangi iwi in New Zealand. I want to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people on whose country the conference is being held, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I honour the land and the peoples who come from it, and the connection that they make to country and culture and community. I also want to say a mihi to the non-Indigenous Australians, and to say that I think you've come a long way. I lived in Sydney in 2000 when you took to the Harbour Bridge. So it's nice to see 20 years later you walking the talk and the acknowledgements to country. I also want to say a mihi to Ngāti Tō Rangatira, who are the iwi on the lands where I live. I also want to thank Te Herenga Waka Victoria University for the PhD scholarship that I'm supported by. The Health Research Council have funded this with a community action grant. I want to acknowledge support from the My network, which is the Māori and Indigenous network. A lot of the writing and thinking for this work came at retreats. And also to the people who in the community that we spoke to for the Connecting Kai research. So the research question we had was, what can we learn about local food security from the community response? The project was set up in 2 streams. The theoretical framework for this stream and this piece of work is Merton's Critical Social Justice, and it's a case study including 13 stakeholder interviews. The other stream is a kaupapa Māori based stream. Just in case I run out of time, through this I'm going to talk about the things that we sort of learnt from this research process.
Kahurangi, can we just check, the slide that we can see hasn't changed over on the screen. Should we be seeing a different slide up now?
Yeah. Where are you? What does your slide look like now?
So we still have your cover slide up at the moment.
Stop sharing and start sharing again.
Okay.
That hasn't changed.
No, it hasn't changed. Do we? Oh, hang on. Now something's happening.
Okay, right. Let's try.
And can we make that full on the screen so we can,
I think
That's
this
a good
one.
and just maximise the browser, please?
Yeah. Okay, do you want to just try advancing to the next slide?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
that's it.
perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, sorry.
No, that's okay. That's great. Okay, right. So there we are. All our acknowledgements. The process. If I run short of time, this is what we're going to hopefully cover. Courageous and visionary leadership that was demonstrated by these two organisations. A location, which Mark was sort of talking about in the previous presentation. It was really critical to have a site, a physical location. In this COVID response, a reliable food supply was also required. The organisations sort of managed their way through finding their strengths in their response, and engaging with government was really hard. So highlighting this story, it starts with the pace of the lockdown. The first COVID case in New Zealand was announced on the 28th of February, and less than a month later, the government had introduced a 4-tier alert system. Then within 48 hours, we were told that we were at level 3, so effective immediately, and then 48 hours after that, we were going to level 4, which was going to be one of the most restrictive environments as a response to COVID. It just happened really quickly. So the government wasn't quite sure what was happening, and neither were community organisations. To stay open, you could be an essential service. At the centre of this case study was Common Unity, and they had created a lot of connections within their community. But that illustration on the left shows that a lot of those places were places that provided food to people in the community. So what happened in this lockdown was that all of a sudden, places that food vulnerable people access food were suddenly cut off. So it was a broken food system for people who don't rely on the retail conventional food system. So schools closed, so children that would attend breakfast and lunch programs didn't access that, and they were suddenly at home needing to be fed. Cafes and retail outlets who would redistribute food were suddenly closed. And yeah, agencies didn't know what was happening. So just all of a sudden, all of these other places shut down. Common Unity had done a lot of work in networking, and one of the things that was the basis of their sort of network was an urban farm network that was providing fresh produce. But in the lockdown, most of these sites were located in homes or locations that were owned by government agencies. So there was a garden in Ipuni School, there was a garden in a youth justice facility, there were gardens in the Kāinga Order homes, which is what this is. So that's Housing New Zealand properties. Access to all of those farms was denied. So all of a sudden, that food supply stopped as well. The one thing that did remain, which I'll talk more about in a minute, was the relationship continued with Rimataka Prison, because the prison was in lockdown already. Nothing needed to change for that relationship to continue. So one of the learnings, the two women ran these organisations, and it was courageous. So it was happening really quickly, this change, and the rules, all of a sudden, New Zealanders became very rule oriented, and we were told to stay home, and we did. And we were told what were essential services, and they were pretty much supermarkets. It was very clear supermarkets were okay. Everything else was questionable. So as the lockdown was sort of proceeding, it was really difficult to know if you could operate or not legally. So it took courage and vision for these organisations to say, actually, we need to service and look after our community. So that's Julia Milne there. Yeah, walking the talk. Like I said before, and Mark spoke about before and yesterday, having a location was really critical. Government response there was no response from government in this lower Hutt region or the Hutt Valley region in Wellington. So these two community organisations did it. Common Unity had the site. They had this old plaster factory. That's that at the bottom. And they also had an off-grid kitchen. So they were able to continue to make meals and had a place where they could accept and receive food. So the next thing about this response was that it needed a reliable food supply. And like I explained about the farms, a lot of that had changed. But what happened, Common Unity were well connected. So they knew the Lower Hutt Food Bank, who were closing. And that was the thing, 3 out of 4 food support organisations in the Valley closed. And I think that was typical of the response throughout the country. Most of them are run by vulnerable volunteers, elderly people, and they were concerned, so they stayed home. And often on small sites. So there were really sort of stringent physical distancing requirements. So you had to have a big site pretty much to stay open. But the Lower Hutt Food Bank gifted their food pantry and their and money to help start off Common Unity's response. Then Remataka Prison was no change there. Kibosh was a food rescue organisation, and they had quite interesting things happening with food rescue. So a lot of the restaurants and retail outlets had closed, so there was no food rescue coming from there. But all of a sudden there were these really sort of interesting things coming because our borders closed, so international food supply chains were disrupted. And so, yeah, all of a sudden we had really interesting things coming out of that international food supply chain coming back, redistributing into these local food supply chains. And schools were closed. So a national initiative is the fruit and vegetables in school program, and that they redistributed locally as well. Yeah, as I mentioned before, corrections was really an interesting thing that corrections were able to be quite significant in this food supply chain. Significant for the men there as well and the families. So the food that they were growing was going out to families, often their own families, who were in those communities. I talked about knowing your strengths. So in the beginning, Common Unity were trying to manage the food supply, but also distribute. And they soon realised that they didn't know the communities well enough, and what their strength was in this food supply chain and being able to produce meals. And that's a chef, Isaac, also came on board at that time, so they were able to scale up in the production of that whole thing as well. They removed barriers where they could too, so both organisations were had paid staff, so they were able to do things. They were able to try and contact government. You know, they were able to do things that small voluntary organisations couldn't. And both organisations had the same value system about providing food for anybody who needed it. So it was just really straightforward and an easy connect for them. The final learning that we that came through from the research was that engaging with government was really problematic for everybody. Like I said, the community had a staff, but a lot of the staff time was spent trying to figure out how to operate. Businesses who were wanting to redistribute food found it really difficult with local councils and even food banks. It's not it's a comment more about the difficulty in the situation and the pace that change happened more than unhelpful or bureaucracy. It was difficult, but it was because it was unknown. So the lessons that we had for third sector organisations from this was leadership capabilities are really important, and they're worth the investment for a crisis. Yeah, these women were connected and confident in their roles and in their communities, and their visibility as well also sort of anchored the response. Communities need to know where their food is. This is one of the things that sort of was evident. Nobody knew, you know, so in those first days of lockdown, a huge amount of time and energy was spent from these paid at-home team at Community trying to figure out where food might come from. So as far as a crisis response goes, communities and government, local government, do need to know, you know, they need to know the local food ecosystem. And it's easy enough too to locate a site, but a physical site is important, and that Remakery site has car parks. So in that physically distant way, they could operate. Yeah. So and just a tip for them that in an emergency, make friends. You know, that's what they're going to do. And they do need to network with local government. They need to know, who's around, who's going to be operating. And finally, from this, we just thought that it was the creative and courageousness of the third sector organisations which was contributing to food justice and the common good. So we were considering food networks and food resilience as public good. And the sharing of food by those community organisations was aspirational. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kahurangi. That was a very inspiring presentation. So I'll remember holding questions over to the end. Ikenna, I'll hand over to you to come and talk to us next. And just whilst your slides are being set up, I'll read out the title of your presentation. So COVID-19 footprint on NGOs, achievements and challenges in creating public good. Thank you. Ikenna,
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to make this presentation. The broader aspect of it has been published. So yeah, just going through. So the presentation will cover the background, operations and management of NGO and their relevance, methodology, data analysis, then followed by a presentation of the findings, conclusions, and what we make out of the research. Future outlook and response to lessons learned. So, reports show that COVID-19 pandemic is far from over as cases continue to rise globally, affecting the social mission of the development agents, such as the NGOs. This study is centered in developing country and using Nigeria as a case study. The United Nations expressed concern over the impact of COVID-19 pandemic during the launch of the Nigerian UN COVID Basket of Fund, and expressly stated that response should equal the scale of the pandemic and must include testing, tracing, isolation, and treatment. And that their partner NGOs are well equipped to be able to provide the needed support for the Nigerian community. NGOs as a whole is seen as in Nigeria as the hope of common man, the voice of the excluded members of the community, the poor, and the vulnerable community in general. So as more households further live below the poverty line, income inequality widens, which increases the burden on the vulnerable communities to which these NGOs cater to. So the impact of COVID continues to attract interest and research, the link with the global vision of the sustainable development champions, such as the NGOs, has not been in focus. Generally, people have studied about the reporting standard during COVID-19, and people have also studied about environmental impact of COVID, but no study has actually tried to look into how this crisis, COVID-19 crisis, has affected development agents such as the NGOs, who are at the grassroots trying to support the vulnerable communities, the poor, and the excluded members of the community, especially in developing countries, because they play a vital role in supporting those who have nobody to support them, especially in countries where the government is unable to address the social needs of the people. So this is the COVID-19 situation by region. I am not going to dwell about on that. So COVID-19 operations and management. NGOs tend to work towards common goals through contributions from volunteers. Just as explained, the Basket of Fund. The Basket of Fund was a pool of funds from which government and the United Nations contributed, had funds where from there they support those who are impacted by COVID. So these are the responsibilities, the duties of NGOs, what they do and how they operate to support members of the community. They are self-governing and charitable organizations that are motivated by general welfare of the people. NGOs represent important actors for fostering positive economic and ecological development, especially in developing countries. They are very, very important in policy formulations, both to the private sectors and to the government themselves, and trying to ensure checks and balances between the excesses of the government and the expectations of the public. So NGOs have become critical actors in governance and policy formulations, especially in Nigeria, where the study is centered. So what we did is that we adopted an interpretative perspective to gather detailed explanations from 25 key NGO employees to know how they were impacted. The research used multiple case study designs, which made it possible to answer the how, why, and what questions. This is because Nigeria is a very large country made up of over 200 million people. So to be able to cover the country effectively and ascertain how the impact of COVID-19 crisis was among the NGOs trying to raise the resilience level of the Nigerian people, we tried to interview NGOs in the southeast of Nigeria, southwest of Nigeria, north central, and south-south. That now covered the whole country. So in the major cities of these, there are big NGOs centered all over Nigeria. So we met with one NGO in each of these regions, 4 regions. So in the southeast, we interviewed NGOs located in Enugu, which is the major city in the southeast, 17 southwest, Lagos, and that continued. So all the places in Nigeria and all the major cities in Nigeria. So these are the responses of the 25 key NGO employees and the interviewees and their locations and their descriptions. So we analyzed the data using Faraday and Moore-Cochrane's hybrid approach for data analysis. This hybrid approach for data analysis encompasses inductive and deductive coding method. The interviews were recorded and originally transcribed verbatim and carefully scrutinized while listening to the records. So the transcript were read several times, up to 4 times, while the recording was being played. This helps to identify any issues or any misunderstanding in the transcript and correct them to ensure effective, accurate reporting of the responses. So a summary of the transcript was prepared for each interview, which highlights the main theme that emerged from it. So this was then put into NVivo for analysis. It was coded and labeled, which gave rise to the main theme that informed the patterns and the relationship that informed the impact of COVID-19 on NGOs. So the findings was very interesting. The research showed that COVID-19 impacted NGOs both positively and negatively. So we start with the negative ones, because the a priori expectation was that it would be negative impact. So the research found out that there was a decline in health-seeking behavior of the public, because people feared to go to hospital, people feared to go and receive treatment because they believe, the people in the community, the people in the hospital have COVID, so it's going to transfer. The people treating them have COVID. So there is this, and also there is stigma that when you get it, you will not be accepted in the community. So health-seeking behavior of people reduced, low capacity building. The rate at which NGOs organize capacity building for the locals, for the vulnerable communities, skill acquisition, all these things reduced. Reduced because people are no longer coming out because of the strict restrictions because of the COVID. At every stage of the mutation of the virus, stricter conditions were given, which restricted movement, restricted people, and with fear of this, including the stigma, people, they were no longer doing most of the things they were doing. There was also increased costs arising from PPE. They were provisioning for PPE, masks, to be able to keep up to the standard, to the requirement, to the WHO guidelines for COVID. So this increased costs because these were not planned for in the beginning. People at the lower level of the NGOs, including maybe drivers, delivery people, and messengers, a lot of them lost their job because to be able to control the COVID, the policy of the government then was, okay, only senior staff members have to be going to work. People who really are very critical, very important members of it should go to work. So this made a lot of people to lose their job. And at the extreme, some people got the virus and they did not survive from it. So this, it was a similar thing repeated in all the NGOs, almost all the NGOs. And this is a typical example to portray this. This now formed the discussion in the paper, because as I said, this is already a published paper. So now, despite the gloom caused by the COVID, there is some positive outcomes we learned. We learned that during the COVID, they had to think out of the box. They had to, it led to innovation, the use of virtual methods, virtual means of working. People learned that they could work from home and do certain things that they were usually doing from the office. This was innovative. There was peer-to-peer interventions. People could do, the NGOs could do index texting because people are more targeted. People are more targeted. People who have HIV in this location, okay, they take their drugs at once in one particular place for them to pick it. So there was peer-to-peer interventions. This was not in place before. This was an idea that the COVID-19 brought to them. So there was also management of resources. They had to save cost because through refreshment, before the NGOs meet the community, the beneficiaries, they have to engage them, like stakeholder engagement. They have to hire a hall, buy drinks, entertain them. So all this cost was saved because then there was no longer meeting. It had to be virtual, and when you want it to be physical, or the government said we cannot come, because these are the expectations. They want to come to meetings because from there will be food, there will be tips, there will be so many things, transportation. So all these things were cut off. So they saved money in that aspect, and there was also this flexibility and proactiveness learned as a result of COVID. This was a similar thing that the most popular responses was completed in all the NGOs from where the thing was developed, which was what we discussed. All right. In conclusion, it was clear that first, the negative impact actually outweighed the positive impact. It was clear that the development agencies could not perform optimally during the crisis, because the responses is an indicative example given in the tables above showed that they couldn't do things they used to do before. The crisis weakened both the capacity and the skills needed to provide the much needed services by the NGOs. As I said, NGOs are very critical actors in the development of developing nations because they act as a bridge between the excesses of the government and the expectations of the people. So the NGOs, the funding to the NGOs also reduced significantly. This was heightened by the withdrawal of support by Trump's and his administration in July 2020. Because of the personal issues he was having, so he withdrew support funding going to WHO. This affected a collective pool of resources that NGOs usually use to work. The pandemic proves that social justice and ecological integrity, economic stability have been long compromised. We saw how birds were trapped by masks, wastes was they were unable to control wastes resulting from COVID-19 requirements, PPEs, and all that. So ecological ecological integrity has been long compromised, and this has also heightened the dangers for climate change and all that kind of thought. So what do we then take out of this? Future outlook. Future outlook. So emergency response procedures will need to be improved. Internal capacity should be developed in NGOs to be able to seek for and respond to global health security with promptness that it deserves, especially in these places where they are very well needed in the development of the country. Portfolio diversification. The table shows that there is a need for portfolio diversification. Fundings are reducing in NGOs. So there's a need for counterpart funding opportunities, looking for ways to fund. Government, they say that where your money is where your heart is. So there should be a need, there's a need for the NGOs to have a way of commitment, getting commitment of government, so that they commit themselves to counterpart funding. Waste management and disposal. It was clear that waste management was very poor. So there's a need for a policy framework that is related to emergency and biodiversity, disaster response mechanisms in NGOs to preserve the ecosystem. So, and lastly, there's need for increased technical assistance towards the downward beneficiaries. We said that the capacity building was very low during the COVID. So there is need to develop the capacity of the beneficiaries so that they will be able to do things by themselves. When people, NGOs cannot come for certain things, they should be able to do it. And this will help them to prepare for ownership and sustainability. Thank you very much for listening. And if there is any question, someone else has to present.
Yes, yeah, question there. Thank you very much. Thank you. So we have one more presenter. So Dee will be presenting to us next. Let's get his slides up. And he's going to be presenting to us on the topic, a helper who cannot help himself, the role of Chinese grassroots NGOs during the COVID-19 pandemic. Dee, thank you so much.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Yu. I'm a PhD student from University of Melbourne. Yeah, today is my honor to present our ongoing research on the role of Chinese community-based NGOs during the COVID-19 pandemic to all of you. And it's not finished yet, but I would like to share some of my preliminary findings and my ideas with you. Yeah. So I would like to situate my research into the field of the NGOs' role in disaster management in an authoritarian context. And we all know NGOs are very helpful in disaster management, and they can help and they can assist and complement the government in the disaster relief. But in an authoritarian context, the things could be a bit complicated because NGOs are helpful, but they also expect to be check on the state power. So there's confrontation between the authoritarian state and NGOs. So during the disaster, they have they tend to NGOs are needed by the people and by the government, but also during the pandemic, the government's wrongdoings may be exposed, so which may cause criticism, and this will result in some conflicts or confrontation between the NGOs and the government. So in authoritarian regimes, during the pandemic or during disasters, sometimes the government would try to encourage the service provision by the NGOs, but on the other hand, it will punish these opposition activities. So existing literatures on the NGOs' activities during pandemic have found that NGOs, the authoritarian governments use the COVID-19 pandemic as a pretext to justify their crackdowns on civil societies. And for example, some emergency laws, very common practice during the pandemic, and they have been used to restrict critical operation. And the case of China, I would like to talk about the crisis management in China. The 2008 Wenchuan earthquake is the one of the deadliest disaster in PRC history. Was a watershed. Before that, the crisis management was a top-down process, monopolized and mobilized by the state, and there was not many. And in 2008, during the Wenchuan earthquake, we can see we witnessed civil society boom because at that time, after decades of the reform and opening up, the civil society organizations grasped the space left by the government. So at that time, after the earthquake, many NGOs and volunteers rushed in to offer help, and some even established offices to coordinate the NGO relief activities. So it's unprecedented. So it caused a lot of attention. It attracted a lot of attention, and at that time, the government, at the beginning, the government generally willing to accept them, to incorporating them into the relief network. But right after that, for some reason, from some recent research, some researchers found that this honeymoon period has already may have already ended because the government now the local government trying to go up or control these local NGOs because they think they try to intervene their operations and they try to cut off their connection with their foreign partners, so to make them to keep them under control. Yes. And this my research is focused on the Chinese NGOs during the COVID-19 pandemic. Just like what I have mentioned before, we can see a pattern of NGOs during a disaster in an authoritarian context. Because when the long after the disaster, the NGOs we can see a civil society boom. NGOs become very active in the relief, in the crisis relief. But not long after that, the government gradually learn how to manage it and try to keep them under control. So does the same pattern happen in during the pandemic, or does the Chinese government manage to tame these NGOs? So this is what I want to explore in my research, and I particularly pay attention to the grassroots NGOs or community-based grassroots NGOs in my research. What is grassroots NGOs? Compared to they are compared to the government-organized NGOs, the GONGOs. So they are established by the ordinary citizens, and they focus on public interest. Yeah, so they share more similarities with their Western counterparts. So they are more autonomous. They can set agendas. They can elect their leaders, and then they have their own missions. So to focus on this part, we can learn how these NGOs engage in the how the civil society actors and how these NGOs engage in the disaster relief in China. And in this research, I only focus on community-based NGOs, those which means the NGOs based themselves in urban communities. They provide service to the migrant workers. Because of the household registration system in China, some migrant workers they move from their hometown to a more prosperous cities. They don't share the same social welfare system with the locals, so they need more support from the city, and some NGOs emerge to provide service to them. So my research is focused on this kind of NGOs. And in China, these grassroots NGOs face very stringent regulatory frameworks. Some researchers use corporatism to analyze this, because there's a very high threshold for NGO registration. They can hardly get large numbers of them cannot get a legal identity. Yeah, so they remain unregistered, or they register as a business entity. So this may become an excuse for the government to crack down on them. Yeah, and the second pressure is economic pressure. In recent years, in 2020, the NGO came into effect, and then their activities in China are restricted. But some local NGOs find it difficult to get sponsorship from from their foreign donors. Yeah, and some of them will fall into the economic crisis. And the last is the political pressure. Yeah, for some NGOs engaged in some rights advocacy activities, they may face harassment or crackdowns by the police. Yes, so in recent years, we have already experienced we already witnessed several waves of crackdowns by the state. Yeah, my message is in this interview and document analysis, I would analyze the government document to explore how the government try to manage and regulate these NGOs to the pandemics, and using the interviews to explore how NGOs respond to the pandemic and the state policies. At this stage, at this moment, it's really hard to approach government officials, so I mainly approach NGO practitioners from community-based grassroots NGOs in the southern province. I plan to make 15 NGOs, but now currently I complete 50%. Yeah, I try to. Here is some of my preliminary findings. First is I try to divide the pandemic in China into two stages. One stage is features the Wuhan lockdown in early 2020. And existing literature mainly focus on this stage, and they generally thought that they have already mentioned that NGOs at that time just play somehow marginalized a role in that time because the government imposed some very restrictive policies. So I go back to the documents, to the directives issued by the government. We can see clearly that the government assign different tasks to different roles of NGOs based on their relationship with the government. For example, this is what I call the graduated mobilization. For example, the Congos and Justice Foundations, like Red Cross, like some charity federations, yeah, they are designated as authorized donation recipients. All the donations public donations nationwide should go into these organizations, and then they will distribute these donations to the needy community, needy people, and needy organizations. And for the industry associations and chambers of commerce in the research of the state society relationship in China, we regard these organizations as a kind of NGOs. So in theory, they're expected to be a bridge to connect the government and their members. But in reality, they in most cases they are the followers of the state policy. They're expected to support the state policies. So in February 2020, when the whole country was into lockdown, and government suspend all the business and production activities. So at that time, the government issued a document and require all these organizations to support these policies. So they have to mobilize their members and to follow these instructions and to take loss for the lockdown to support the government's decisions. And by the end of the February, when the infections in Wuhan was under control, and the government quickly tried to resume the production and business, then these organizations also shift to support the latest government policies. So, for the most autonomous grassroots NGOs, they're referred to as service providers at the community level to provide support to the local community. Yes, and at that time, when the whole country was in lockdown and the mobilization was restricted, we cannot see many NGOs active nationwide or play a very vital role in some places. It's really hard to find that. So generally, it's a very state dominant model. The government take charge and they just assign a very limited space for the NGOs. Yes. After the Wuhan lifted lockdown, China entered the second stage. But at that time, but even until now, the government still trying to pursue a zero COVID strategy, and some kinds of restrictions remains. So generally, you can say that when there is a detected case, there will be some kinds of lockdown there. So based on my interviews, we can see that the grassroots NGOs mainly face three types of challenges. First, financial hardship. Just as what I said, in 2020, the Oxfam was forced to withdraw the financial supports because of the political pressure by the government, by the local government, and these organizations, almost all of them have a economic connection with Oxfam. They suddenly suffer loss. So and then they face financial hardships after that. Yeah, and political pressure. All the 8 organizations I studied, they maintain a very loose connection with the government, but some of them engage in some sensitive activities in previous years. So during the pandemic, they still experience some harassment by the government. So, and 2 of them are forced to disband themselves during the pandemic. Yeah, and the last is the harsh lockdown measures, which affects their daily operations. Yeah, for example, during the in the last 3 years, a mass gathering are not encouraged by the government. So these organizations are very cautious in organizing big activities or some cross-regional activities. And during this period, they receive very limited resource support by the government. They receive limited support by the government. Okay, and as for the responses by these grassroots community-based NGOs, I conclude 3 types of strategies. The first is to keep their organizations afloat. So they explore new fundraising channels. But they try to turn to public support by using some crowdfunding online platforms, or launch some monthly donations projects to collect donations from the public. Yes, and the second is to try to be self-help network. For example, in early 2020, when the city was into lockdown and there was a shortage of face masks, some activists they organized and formed online mutual help group, and many grassroots organizations join in, and then they join together to buy face masks via all possible channels, and then they distributed these face masks to the needy groups, and then the receiving further distribute these face masks to the community. Yeah, and during the pandemic, many migrant workers lost their jobs, especially the women migrant workers. So one organization came up with the idea that these migrant workers are good at doing household chores. So maybe they can offer cleaning services in the neighborhoods. So this organization act as a coordinator, trying to connect, trying to match these unemployed migrant workers with potential clients. As this is how they try to weave the self-help, and also they also organize some online and offline regular gatherings to provide opportunities for these migrant workers to share their feelings, share their experience, share their confusions with each other. To make them have a sense of belonging during the pandemic. Yeah, and the last one is to explore the safer ways to advocate. NGOs by nature we strive to speak out for the underprivileged. So even the space for advocacy have diminished sharply in the last few years, and they still try to explore some safer ways to advocate for the needy people. And one feasible way during the pandemic is to conduct community surveys and then write reports. And for example, they may investigate how the migrant workers or how the children in the community are impacted by the policy, by the COVID-19 policies or by the COVID-19. And this is how they advocate for the needy people. Yeah. And for some discussion is that because we can see there's no civil society born during the pandemic in China, and then the government will maintain a very restrictive regulatory framework during in this period. So it's worth exploring whether it is a new corporate regulatory framework on the making. Yeah, and then. Besides focusing on the NGOs themselves, we can also pay attention to some temporary volunteering activities, just like what I said, the face smart groups. And they're flexible, and they are not there. There's no organizations, and which made them hard to control. So we can also I think they are worth exploring in the future to see how the civil society responds to tightened control by the government. Yes, and this is my research. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Really appreciate that. Now, so we've got a little bit of time for questions, and as I said, I think we've got a few minutes into morning tea if people have got questions. So, and I know I've got a few saved up, but let's start with everyone else. Has anyone got a question that they'd like to ask one of our presenters? No? Or, John, go on.
Can we get Kahurangi up on the screen?
Yes.
Rather than the...
Right.
Is that possible?
Yeah.
Okay.
Kahurangi, can you hear us okay?
I can, thank you.
Oh,
Excellent.
we can see you now too.
Good. John.
Yeah, kia ora, Kahurangi. My first question is to you, but I'm going to generalise it also, if I may, to the subsequent two, not Mark, unfortunately, because it doesn't quite apply, but the subsequent two presenters. And Kahurangi, I was just interested to learn from you to what extent, if at all, you felt that Te Kanga Māori influenced the response in the Lower Hutt to the food crisis. The stories, the descriptions you gave of the response. Do you think there was something distinctive in the way that, and I'm also from New Zealand, I'm the only New Zealander here in Perth today. Do you think there was something distinctive about civil society's response in New Zealand that was influenced by Māori custom, tradition and norms.
Kia ora, John. Thank you. I did catch your talk yesterday and figured that you were the New Zealander that they were talking about. I think there was. I mean, for that particular case, definitely. Like, we often talk in the research team about how the shared values are really the same. So, you know, in a Māori value is Māori values of kaitiakitanga and manaakitanga, you know, like sort of caring for people and looking after people. And that manaakitanga in that mana enhancing way, so looking after people in really respectful, dignified ways. So just acknowledging this terrible situation, and there are so many people without food. And so Common Unity just had that same sort of value system that where everybody should be valued for who they are, and if people are without food, you know, this is our work to provide food, to do what we can. So yeah, you know, it's probably the organisation both as well, really sort of grounded in land, you know, in whenua and the growth of things. So yeah, for me, very much consistent and driven by Māori values. Thank you.
And if I may hog the stage for a moment, because you know I've got an interest. I'm hoping to develop an interest in exploring Indigenous traditions of philanthropy rather than that sort of Western construct that we throw on everything. So I'm just curious, for example, do you think that the response in Nigeria to any extent was shaped by Indigenous West African Nigerian customs and norms relating to, and the word philanthropy is probably not appropriate in your context, but to pro-social behaviour and pro-social giving. And also I'd like to throw that question later at you, and to what extent the responses in China were formed by Chinese traditions of giving or responding to crises. So maybe Ikenna first.
Yeah, I get your question very well, because most times Western cultures and way of doing things try to dominate what goes on there. So if you, in the larger published paper or in the tables that I put up, you will find out that part of the things that influence that affected the impact was in the way that people perceive even the works of the NGOs. Most times it is seen as just a Western ideology. For example, even the COVID itself, people in the remote areas saw it as just a conspiracy theory, while people in the urban places saw it as an opportunity for the government officials to embezzle money again. So, the way that people accept these NGOs, even the services, culture influences the way these things are done. I have another paper that is still under review that I've brought out these issues more clearly, but in the context of this, it relates more, because the work that I did was to know how the COVID impacted the NGOs themselves, But then when the decline in health-seeking behaviors, decline in their capacity building, they were all incorporated into the culture, the way they also even perceive these things. Or these people want to use me as an experiment. That is where the culture comes in there, like the way they perceive the services. It is possible that these people want to come and say, I have even contacted the COVID and use me for experiment. This kind of ideologies also still exist. Yeah.
And in China, was the grassroots NGO movement in some way motivated by kind of traditional Chinese values?
Yeah.
Or is it something that's kind of, is it a structure that's imposed by trying to conform to Western notions of NGOs and how civil society should be?
I'm not sure I have the answer, but I think just as what I said in my presentation, I think we should pay more attention to some ad hoc activities because they just inspired by the people's good views. I think it's how tradition made a difference. It's a difference because people are good view and they organize and like-minded people, and then they had to stretch their hands to other people, people in need, and they help the people. Yeah, and especially those people with resources. There may be entrepreneurs, or there may be some local residents. They have resources so that they can help people. I think it's one possible way that the tradition made a difference.
I had a question I think is relevant to most of the presenters, and that is, you're talking about crises which put pressure on the government civil society boundary in various different ways, because civil society organisations were criticising government policy or government wasn't stepping up to provide things that maybe they should have, or maybe government was stepping in to actually provide things that previously civil society had provided. So I was just interested in that tension on the boundary. We try and keep a boundary there. Should we have as strict of a boundary as we do? Did the crisis, do you think, change where that boundary actually sits? Like in Australia, we normally say, well, political parties in some ways not part of civil society as we normally see it. We sort of see that more in the government tent, because it's a part of leading to coercive practices that, that's one way of doing things, but civil society is about people voluntarily coming together to do things. So I'm just sort of interested in your sort of view on whether the crisis that you're looking at and the civil society context in the jurisdiction that you're looking at, whether you think it made a difference to where we draw that boundary between government and civil society. But that wants to start. Maybe Ikenna, I'm looking at you. Do you?
I'm not sure I got your question.
I could kick off if you want.
Yes.
This our broader research project touches on a lot of that stuff. So that I guess the relationship between government and civil society and how it might have shifted or changed in the pandemic. So we found at the beginning of the pandemic that the relationships really mattered. So the government, there was a Conservative government in Australia at the time, so the government locked out any voice and didn't want to hear. They needed to hear from civil society because they didn't have all the answers, and they'd spent 15 to 20 years carving out the public service in Australia. So they needed civil society to know what was actually going on the ground. They needed civil society to give them policy solutions. They needed civil society to tell them what would happen, for example, in Melbourne if they shut down, they were going to shut down childcare centres, and the NGO sector said, no, if you do that, you will collapse the Australian economy. And so they needed expertise, they needed to know what was going on, they needed civil society for all these things. But because they'd spent so many years undermining those relationships, they were only talking to people who they'd already had a relationship with. So there was this quick kind of reorientation of relationships between government and civil society that caused a lot of civil society organisations to have this hope that there was just going to be this new normal, this new kind of configuring of government and civil society relationships after the pandemic. And there's also a lot of, in New South Wales and Victoria, at least from what we heard, a complete change in the funding conditions that governments and philanthropists gave to civil society organisations. So they'd spent 15 to 20 years narrowing the funding conditions and turning the screws and saying, yeah, we'll give you this, but you've got to do this, this and this with it. And it's never community-based work. It's always, do this service, provide this many beds, whatever. But they just threw that out the window. The New South Wales and Victorian state governments in particular, the Departments of Communities and Justice there, they basically just said, just do what you got to do. And tell us as you're going along. So they kind of opened up, gave more flexibility to those organisations and kept in contact with them more. So it kind of strengthened some of those relationships, which it's too soon yet to know whether that is going to be a reconfiguring of the relationships, but I think it's kind of hopeful.
Okay,
Oh, sorry, Kahurangi, do you want to comment?
Oh yeah, I'm not sure if you could see me nodding away there, but it was very similar, Mark, in New Zealand. The response, the reformulating of this relationship that had been so undermined over decades, and the community were actually the only ones capable of responding to a lot of these situations because there just was no longer capacity in government. And then in New Zealand, the government leveraged themselves. So, you know, borrowed billions of dollars to sort of secure their way out of this response. And what it did, so suddenly there was all this money flowing into community, and also the same thing, Mark, about that freeing up of just all the sort of bureaucratic and logistical barriers disappeared. So and in New Zealand now we are hoping for a reformulation of that boundary, but yeah, and the criticisms are that we are going back to the way things sort of were, but still hopeful that things were different during that time.
Thank you. Ikenna.
yeah, I think there's a kind of synergy between the government and the civil society in Nigeria during the crisis, because they had a collective goal of raising the resilient level, because every prediction was that it is going to be worse in Africa. You know, and from the table, the graph I had, the pandemic level, you say Africa had missed. But it wasn't because of efforts of the government or efforts of the support of people. It was because, the second time, it was because of people were worried about the stigma. People were not reporting. The contact tracing was poor. The reporting was poor. People were getting the COVID and treating themselves. And also, these were part of the reasons why it was not as seen as a heavy impact in the African community. So through the basket of funds by the United Nations, they had a pool of funds where they had this support, they pooled funds to support the community. So there is that synergy between the civil society and what they're doing. And that was because there is this common goal to raise the resilience level. It's not as if there is such a fantastic relationship between them before, because this one is an opposing body to the other always. Yeah.
Thank you. Indeed. Did you want to say something?
I think that in China, in the case of China, I think the government trying to reshape the state-civil society relationship. Yeah, it's always a state-dominant model in China, but in the past, the government retreat a little bit and leave some space to the NGOs. But in recent years, the government tried to move back and try to exert their authorities over the society. So, and during the pandemic, this trend continues. And so I think. They just want the government as a mere helper of the government. Want NGOs to be the mere helper of the government.
Yeah, sounds like the Australian coalition government. So that's fun.
And potentially, we have an election in 12 months, so we just want to keep our fingers crossed that there's not a shift to the right in New Zealand.
Yeah.
Now, just conscious of time, we probably should finish up there, head down to morning tea. But if you have more questions, feel free to approach our presenters. Hopefully everyone will be down at morning tea and we can keep talking to them there. Kahurangi, thank you so much for dialing in and talking with us.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Good to meet you. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
So I had a question for you. You know, based on because I know you are trying to estimate how the pandemic impacted the students.
Yeah.